It's not often one gets a call from one's agent with a request to catch a hasty plane for Paris to meet a film director. Come to think of it, it's not often one gets a call from one's agent. However, on this particular day, my agent did indeed call to say an American director, Joe Strick, was casting the movie version of Henry Miller's book, Tropic of Cancer, and wanted me to fly over to Paris and audition for him. Now, as I'm sure every teenager who has sneakily panted over those hidden hard covers on their parents' bookshelves knows, this volume brought Henry Miller fame as a pornographer, although eventually it achieved the status of a modern masterpiece. It is, in fact, autobiographical and concerns the sexual experiences of a young man finding himself stranded in Paris. The part the director had me in mind for was one of Miller's ex-mistresses. In the book, she's a married woman with aspirations to becoming a concert pianist, but for reasons that will eventually be revealed in more ways than one, if not two, the film company decided she should instead be an aspiring ballerina, a whim which her exceedingly rich husband indulges by building her a dance studio at the back of their large country mansion. Now, I am not a particularly filmic creature, so I was sceptical about my chances of actually getting the part. But I didn't mind too much. The trip to Paris was exciting enough. I was met at Orly Airport by Joe Strick's secretary, Maggie, and limousine to one of those wide, elegant Paris streets that make you long to be part of the elite and the hell with those socialist principles. Joe Strick, a big, kindly American, not at all as daunting as I'd expected, explained over a cup of coffee what he wanted. The woman was to be played as a European. He didn't mind from where exactly, and as I can do a pretty convincing general European accent, that was no problem. Then he asked me if I could dance. Yes, I said, but dance how? Well, at a bar. Oh, I can do that, I answered, thinking that perhaps one of the scenes was set in a cocktail bar, and the woman maybe a little the worse for drink, and finding the tempo of the background music irresistible, got up and gyrated accordingly. Would you mind showing me? Asked Mr. Strick. Well, why not use the back of that chair to hold on to? Whoops, I thought, she's obviously drunker than I thought. Clutching the chair, I began to dance as provocatively as I could, throwing a shimmy in here and a hip swivel there, and thrusting out my cross-your-heart to add what I hoped was a bit of seasoning. Mr. Strick looked, well, stricken. No, that's not quite it, he said carefully. What I meant was dancing at a bar, B-A-R-R-E, as in ballet, you know? I said, feeling extremely foolish. Sorry. I readjusted my body, turned my feet outwards as fiercely as I could, and began to plie. Now, this piece of painful contorting demands that you hold tightly onto the bar, or in this case chair, with one hand, and with your back absolutely straight, slowly bend your knees, keeping them at exactly the same angle as your turned-out feet. And while you perform this manoeuvre, your free arms should describe an elegant circle, giving no clue as to the pain you're experiencing in your groin. Do women have groins? Well, there, anyway. Now, it just so happens that I have done ballet ever since I was about 3. Oh, yes, indeed. And I have little certificates to prove it, not to mention the odd snapshot of me being obnoxiously cute, posing in bristly tutu or skimpy tunic. My long-suffering mother would take me to these dance classes once a week, where, along with other unlikely aspirants, I would lollop about, keenly observed by the row of other indulgent mothers who sat knitting or whatever, smiling their approval, and now and again leaping up to adjust a wayward knicker or wipe a dripping nostril. My biggest problem with this form of self-expression has always been that I was born turned in rather than turned out. In my case, very much in. This has meant that my knees and feet simply cannot perform the intensely right-angled demands made by ballet dancing, and my legs remain screwed firmly and vertically into my thighs, as any normal person should be, for heaven's sake. But alas, I can never swing my legs any higher than a coffee table, nor, to my everlasting regret, do the splits. Still, I persevered, encouraged by the masochistic tendencies of my dance teacher. It was she who encouraged what acting talent I had by trilling out over the stoic lady pianist's off-key janglings, "Come on, Sheila, use your face." Thus encouraged, I would summon up all the relevant feelings and indeed use my face. The response I drew from the audience of mothers was one of deep emotion, many of them having to hide their faces in anything they had to hand. It was not until many years later, when I got laughs playing Lady Macbeth, that I realized the awful truth and had to resign myself to never being taken seriously again. I persisted with dance classes on and off over the years, and while I never exactly improved, I acquired just enough technique to get away with looking as if I could do it. Enough, at any rate, for Joe Strick's purposes. "That's fine," he said, putting a welcome end to my demonstration. "That's good." With cautious optimism, I thought, things are looking hopeful. Then came the bombshell. "By the way, can you do it on point?" I froze. I'd once tried to learn to dance on point, and it had nearly killed me. When I finally managed to get myself onto my toes, it was impossible to straighten my bent and buckling knees, and I staggered around for as long as I could bear it, looking like an inebriated frog. How long have I got before you start shooting the scenes?" I asked, as casually as I could, my mind racing. 10 days, came the reply. Do you know, it never ceases to amaze me what actors will do to get roles. And there was no way I was going to let this opportunity slip through my fingers. 10 days, I echoed, my voice sounding higher than I'd intended. Fine. That's about all I need to brush up on my technique. Then, as if that wasn't enough, I was tossed the second bombshell. "How do you feel about doing the dance routine wearing just a tutu and point shoes?" We looked at each other for a few moments. I wasn't absolutely certain what he meant. At least, I hoped I wasn't absolutely certain what he meant. "A tutu and, I hesitated. "No top, bare boobs," he said bluntly. "The sequence is a dream Henry has about you dancing topless. How'd you feel about it?" How I felt was at a loss. I'd never been asked to expose any part of my anatomy to the public before, and although I felt a certain reluctance, the fact that this was a legitimate film being made by a well-known director for a large company and based on a classic, this seemed to make it all right. "Oh, what the hell." "No problem," I said lightly. Lying. And then the true measure of what I had taken on hit me. Oh, not the nudity, although that did hover at the back of my mind. It was the fact that I'd only 10 days to get to grips with that most unnatural form of perambulation. My flight back to London was an hour and a half away. "Would you mind if I phoned the dance centre in Covent Garden to arrange a few private classes? It might be a good idea if I didn't waste any time and started tomorrow." Obligingly, Maggie found the number, and I fixed a lesson for the very next morning with one of the dance instructors. Then I asked Maggie if she knew of somewhere in Paris where I could buy some point shoes. "It'll save me doing it tomorrow." Once again she obliged, looking through the phone book and finding an address. "Come on," she said, picking up her coat. "We'll drop in on the way to the airport." The small shop stood in a narrow cobbled arcade, and we climbed the dark staircase lined with photographs of dancers in various poses, all signed with messages of gratitude and affection. At the top was a heavily embossed glass door, and pushing it open we found ourselves in a dimly lit carpeted salon, down the centre of which stood a regimented row of elegant chairs. A figure appeared from the gloom and glided noiselessly towards us. She was a thin, ageless woman, her hair scooped severely away from her face. "Oui?" She tilted her head to one side like an expectant bird. Maggie's French was way ahead of mine, so I left her to do the explaining, and noticing a display case nearby, wandered over to look inside. There, artistically displayed, were boxes of powder and coloured sticks of makeup and the most unlikely sets of eyelashes, while at the far end was a collection of remarkably small triangular beards. Perhaps they're for dwarves, I thought. How very sweet. How very French. Maggie called me back, and the assistant waved me towards one of the chairs. Then she sat on a low stool in front of me, and putting my unshod foot on what looked like a Japanese growth restrictor, adjusted it to my size and left. "Have you seen what's in there?" I hissed at Maggie. "They have the cutest little beards on display. Probably for tiny folk. Go and look." Maggie went over to look, then came back smiling hugely. "You are naive," she said. "Those are what strippers and dancers wear if they shave themselves down below for work, but want to look normal at other times." This trip was proving educational. The assistant returned, balancing several boxes, one on top of the other. and taking a small square of green plastic, spread it carefully on the floor in front of me. Then opening a box, she reverently took out a shoe, delicately pink, pretty and satin shiny, and with a toe end severely chopped off. She eased my foot into it, stood up, and said with unexpected authority, "Levez!" I stood up and put the toe end of my point-shod foot on the plastic square, reluctant to do much more. "Levez! Levez!" she repeated with some irritation, as though I was deaf, demonstrating with her hands that she wanted me to rise Lazarus-like up onto my toes. I looked helplessly at the two women. "Alors," the assistant said briskly, and waving Maggie to the other side of me, grabbed hold of an elbow, and the two of them hoisted me up. It was excruciating. "Put me down, I shrieked, and dropped back gratefully into the chair. More dialogue passed between them, and eventually a compromise seemed to be reached. I sat there, unprotesting, while my feet were shoved in and out of various sizes of those sneaky implements of torture, until it was eventually agreed which one was for me. I left the shop disheartened, but as I climbed aboard the plane, my spirits lifted. After all, I was going to be filming in Paris, and I was clutching the chicest of plastic bags, in which was my very own pair of genuine ballerina's Parisian point shoes. That night, back in London, Maggie phoned to say she'd be sending a cassette of the music I was to dance to, and asked me to get my ballet coach to devise a short, showy sequence for me to perform. I decided I would start getting used to wearing the shoes that very evening. My mother obligingly sewed the ribbons on that had come with them, both of us guessing where they should go. I was about to slip the shoes on when I remembered seeing dancers wrap their toes in some sort of padding first. All I could find was a roll of cotton wool, which I wound round mine, and then carefully pulled the shoes on, tying the ribbons around my ankles. The moment of truth had come. Gritting my teeth, I tried to get up onto my toes. I couldn't. Making a huge effort, I managed to heave myself up, and with buckled knees lurched to the nearest wall, sending a chair flying as I went. It was useless. And then I had a brainwave. I had some ironing to do. Surely the support the ironing board provided would be just what I needed, not only to keep me up on my toes, but to help me straighten my knees. Thus it was, despite the pain, I ironed my weekly wash, standing on point for almost an hour. When I took the shoes off, I was devastated to find that the heat and pressure of my sweating feet had compressed the cotton wool into a hard, unforgiving wodge, and peeling it painfully away, I found I'd scraped all the skin off the front of my toes. They were raw and red, and I knew I was in trouble. Next day at the dance centre, my coach, Arlene, took one horrified look at my feet and said, "I'm afraid you've blown it. It's unlikely you'd have made it in 10 days anyway, but now no chance. You'll have to wait for them to heal. What you're supposed to do," she said, as if reprimanding a 5-year-old, "is harden the skin of your feet by soaking them in surgical spirit. And when eventually you put on your point shoes, you wrap your toes in animal wool, which has some spring in it. Animal wool, not cotton wool." "Look, Arlene," I said, gripping her shoulders, "I've got to do it. I am going to do it. It's a wonderful part in a real movie with classy people. Oh, come on. It's only a very short sequence," I wheedled, "and we're both being paid." She looked at me, then at my raw feet. "We're both," she said, "being crazy." The first thing we did was abandon the Paris purchases and buy a pair of point shoes larger by 2 sizes, a couple of boxes of animal wool, several bottles of surgical spirit, and a quantity of plasters. We were all set to go. I discovered that point dancing is not, as I had imagined, performed on tiptoe, but on the knuckles of your toes, as it were. What you do is more or less throw yourself onto them. As for actually straightening the knees, well, along with the rest, it demanded many painful hours and much determination. And despite the eye-watering dousing of raw toes in surgical spirit, and the stiffness and cramp of muscles I had no idea existed, not to mention the misery of oiling my very rusty ballet technique, I finally managed to do it. Somehow I managed to do it. And by the time I got to Paris to begin filming, I had a simple but effective routine that I could perform passably well. And very sore feet. The location for the film was at Malmaison, a rather scruffy old mansion just outside Paris which had been built by Napoleon for Josephine. I had only 2 scenes, the first at dinner with my husband and Henry Miller, in which Henry flirts outrageously with me whenever my husband's attention is fixed greedily on his dinner plate. The second was the dreaded dream sequence. Henry Miller was played by an actor of considerable reputation in America, though not well known in the UK. His name, believe it or not, was, and indeed still is, Rip Torn. What's more, he was Rip Torn II, his father having torn it before him. I'd been booked into a small hotel in the centre of Paris. Early each morning a car would pick me up, along with the actor playing my husband, and drive to the location, returning us to the hotel late the same evening. This meant that, disappointingly, I saw very little of the city itself. Nonetheless, I was enjoying myself, and while I was waiting to be used, I watched the other scenes being shot, getting to know the rest of the unit, or wandered around the rambling house and overgrown gardens. Filming abroad is very different to filming in this country. Here in England, it seems to be the unions that run the studios, insisting rigidly on set times for coffee, lunch and tea breaks, and finishing at 5:30 sharp, when the crew pull the plugs, as they call it, even if you happen to be in the middle of shooting a scene. Should the director decide he wants to run into overtime, a union meeting is called then and there, and it has to be agreed unanimously if shooting is to continue. In France, the system is much more relaxed. We would start shooting at 9:30 or so in the morning, break for lunch sometime around 2 o'clock, and go on filming late into the evening until it was decided enough footage was in the can. Unless, of course, they were filming outside, where the light dictated the schedule. Lunches at Malmaison were the most fun. The hired location caterers would put trestle tables out on the vast, untidy front lawn, covering them with plates of cold meats and sausages, varieties of cheeses, huge bowls of salad and fruit, long loaves of crusty bread, and large, unlabelled bottles of the excellent local wine. We would sit on long benches, eating and drinking and chatting in the warm September sunshine. From time to time, Henry Miller himself would arrive in a large car, accompanied by the young son he'd had by his 5th wife, a Japanese jazz pianist of 32 he'd married at the age of 76. They would join us at the lunch table, Henry by this time in his 80s, immaculate in white suit and Panama hat, and looking like a benign, bleached tortoise. He loved the idea that we actresses, there were 3 of us on location at the time, were playing his erstwhile mistresses, and he would twinkle wickedly at us and flirt outrageously. We loved it. One day, as he sat with us at lunch, a glass of wine in one hand, a cigarette in the other, he turned to the director and said, "Tell me, Joe, who is playing the Afro-Asian girl in this movie?" Joe looked puzzled. "What Afro-Asian girl, Henry?" he asked. "Oh, come on, Joe," said Henry with some irritation. "You know, the Afro-Asian girl used to recite the Bible while I was having her." Joe paused, clearly confused. "But Henry," he said, "there is no Afro-Asian girl in Tropic of Cancer." Henry was confounded. "Oh, heck," he said with a regretful shake of the head. "Did I forget to write about her?" As I mentioned, Malmaison was in a state of some disrepair, and the film company had been allowed to adapt a few small rooms upstairs into the makeup and wardrobe departments, as well as a couple of dressing rooms. They'd also been given permission to film in some of the large rooms downstairs, redecorating them to the needs of the scenes being shot. One day, Joe was about to shoot a scene set in a brothel. A long room with an ornate ceiling had been metamorphosed into a sleazy salon crammed with overstuffed sofas and worn chaises longues, on which a dozen or more prostitutes were to lounge provocatively in various states of déshabille. Joe and his secretary had cast a number of dancers and strippers for these roles, on the assumption that they'd be less likely to object to exhibiting various bits of their anatomies to the camera than bona fide actresses. The scene involved Henry Miller and the madame of the establishment, and once the dialogue had been rehearsed and the moves plotted, the extras, for the moment discreetly shrouded in various forms of covering, were given their places and told what was required of them. At last they were ready to shoot. "Right, ladies," called the first assistant, "let's have those wraps off." Off they came one by one, and the ladies stood exposed. Joe stared at his cast of demi-mondaines of the 20s in total disbelief. Shaved. They were shaved, every one of them, not a pube in sight. They were unusable. They would all have to be paid off and sent away. An expensive day's shooting was lost. After a brief and rather heated discussion with Maggie, Joe sat dejectedly in an old, faded armchair while she delivered a short speech in French explaining the problem to the astonished cast and telling them that although they couldn't be used, they would still, of course, be paid. The murmur of disappointment grew as the women got up, replacing their gowns and reluctantly leaving the set. All but one. She'd been sitting quietly in a corner ever since the announcement had begun, her back to everyone and her handbag open beside her. As the room cleared, she forced her way over to where Maggie, Joe and the first assistant were discussing how to deal with the problem. She was clutching her wrap tightly around her. "Pardon, monsieur," she said urgently, tugging at Joe's sleeve. Joe turned with some irritation. "What is it?" He wasn't in the mood for this sort of interruption. The woman launched into a flow of French Joe clearly didn't understand, and he turned to Maggie, gesturing for her to deal with the matter. The woman repeated her speech with even greater animation, and then, throwing open her wrap, stood waiting. The effect was remarkable, not only on the faces of the three she was trying to impress, but on her anatomy. With an eyebrow pencil, she'd painstakingly drawn in a crutchful of careful squiggles to replace the missing pubic hair. I never found out whether they recalled her when they refilmed the scene in the brothel, but I know if it had been me, I'd have given her artwork a special feature of its own. My first scene, the dinner à trois, took 2 days to shoot and seemed to go well. At the end of the second day, Joe beamed at me. "Tomorrow," he said, "is your big day. Ready for it?" "Ready? I can't wait," I said, over brightly, feeling my stomach lurch. I was as ready as I'd ever be. Since I'd arrived in Paris, I'd spent as much time as I could throwing myself onto my toe knuckles in those angrily squared-off shoes and practicing my routine. Early next morning, the car delivered me to Malmaison, and I was shown onto the set. The crew had converted the conservatory at the back of the house into a small dance studio. On one side was a long mirrored wall with a bar screwed into it. On the other side were the full-length windows of the conservatory itself. These had been curtained off to enable the lighting man to get the effects he wanted. Joe called me over to him. "Would you like us to close the set so that only the people directly concerned with shooting the scene are allowed in? It might make it easier for you." "Yes, I'd appreciate that," I said gratefully. I went upstairs to the small dressing room I'd been allocated. Claire, the young French woman who'd been designated my dresser during the filming, was waiting for me. In spite of the language problems, over the few days we'd worked together, we'd become quite friendly. There, laid out neatly on a small bed in the corner, was what could only just be called my costume. A pair of pink knickers and a stiff pink tarlatan tutu, looking like an overgrown pie frill. "You have with you the shoes, oui?" I had with me the shoes, oui. I took them out of their plastic bag, along with the animal wool, the surgical spirit, and my collection of plasters. With a sigh of resignation, I stripped off and dressed, or rather undressed, pulling on the skimpy ballet gear and gratefully accepting the shawl Claire handed me to wrap around my naked top half. Then she reached for the shoes. I stopped her. "Not yet, thank you," I said. "Not just yet." And now it was time to see the make-up man, or rather be seen by him. He was pleasant-faced, small, rotund, and balding, and in his 50s. We stood and eyed each other. "Alors," he said brightly. "First, the face." Relieved, I sat in the swivel chair at the dressing table, covered in pots and puffs, bottles and brushes. He worked in silence, frowning with concentration. When he'd done, he motioned me to look in the mirror, which was brightly lit by a row of bulbs on either side. I saw a pale face with dramatic eyes and hair scraped back. Well, at least I looked like a ballerina. It was now inescapably the time for the body makeup. I stood in front of the little Frenchman and tried to appear nonchalant as I removed the shawl. He kept his eyes down, busily unscrewing the lids off several wide, flat compacts of pancake, sorting out various sponges, then dunking them into a large bowl of water and squeezing them out. I waited, chilly. Eventually he raised his eyes and, taking a step back, looked at my boobs critically through half-closed lids. The longer he looked, the droopier I felt. Then, taking up a large, wet sponge full of makeup, he began to whistle tunelessly between his teeth and briskly busied himself with my upper torso. He worked quickly, whistling continuously, the tip of his tongue protruding slightly from the corner of his mouth. All at once he stopped, sponge in midair. "You are cold?" he asked. He was looking at my nipples. "A little," I said, wishing I could sink through the floor. "I can see," he said, grinning. "You have the gooseberries." "Goosebumps," I corrected, assuming he was referring to the state of my skin and not the measure of my memories. Then he did something that will endear him to me forever. Very delicately, with the tip of his pinky finger, he lifted up one of my boobs and patted beneath it with a makeup sponge, and carefully repeated the operation with the other one. This man, I thought, has class. Back on the set, Joe asked me to show him the dance routine. Claire appeared at my side with the shoes plus all the paraphernalia, and I prepared my feet for action. The sound man put the tape on, the music began, and with it one of the longest and most harrowing days of my life. What I hadn't taken into account was that it's one thing to dance a routine, but quite another to dance a routine to be filmed. First I performed it to show Joe what I was going to do. Next I did it and then redid it for the cameraman, and then did bits of it again for the lighting technician. And when the camera finally turned, I did it in full, I did it in long bits, in short bits, and eventually in static bits. The embarrassment of bouncing boobs was quickly superseded by the torment of tortured toes. I was grateful there was only a skeleton crew to see me suffer, and vaguely wondered what the rest of the technicians were doing with themselves. I found out during a short break while the lights were being refocused. Feeling in need of a breath of air, I strolled round to the back of the house and found a dozen or so of the crew on their knees, betrousered bottoms skyward, as they peered through the gap under the curtains covering the conservatory windows. I couldn't have cared less. By that time my focus was strictly below my waist rather than above it. At lunchtime, Claire found me sitting in my little dressing room, my poor feet propped up on a chair in front of me. I stared at them miserably. "You will take them off, the shoes?" she asked solicitously. "Don't touch them," I yelped. "I'll never get them on again." By tea time I was beyond caring. I felt no pain. I could have gone on indefinitely. Poor Claire was more anxious than ever, and stood watching me pirouette and sweat and endure, her face contorting in sympathy. Finally, and at last, the shoot was over. The day was done, and the scene was, as they say, in the can. Flat-footed and exhausted, and leaning on Claire, I just about managed to haul myself up the stairs to my dressing room. As she peeled the shoes off my numb and almost unrecognizable extremities, I sank back and thought, "Sheila, you've done it. You bloody did it." And that was no exaggeration. In fact, somewhere in a cupboard in an old plastic carrier bag, I have a pair of pink, satin, blood-stained point shoes to prove it. The film did eventually come out. The general view was that it was neither particularly good nor particularly bad. It seems the producers ran out of money, so the quality deteriorated midway. I believe it can be found somewhere or other on video. As for me, well, I was thrilled when I saw it, not least because in it there's a shot of Henry Miller, him very self, standing in the gloom of a Gothic church and slowly, tortoise-like, turning his head to look at the glorious stained-glass windows. Nothing to do with the plot, just a whim of the director's. And now and again, with pride tempered with some disbelief, I remind myself that once I danced for Henry Miller.